Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Staying with politics, Mystery Hour on the way at 12, of course. Do not miss that. I think this week, more than many others, we will welcome the opportunity to dive into the waters of fun and frolics that Mystery Hour represents, but staying at the very sharp end of politics now. And a remarkable contest, if you like, between Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn, the former launching his strongest attack yet on the latter yesterday in an interview with Bloomberg Television. He says Corbyn is doubly wrong because he condemned the war in Iraq and is standing by while Syrian people are barrel bombed. I think I'm going to just ask you to pick a side on this one. Early prediction would be that Corbyn will win hands down. But that could have just been me trolling you. I just can't quite see. I presume, let's just remember very briefly for a moment, however hard it might be, that Tony Blair is actually a human being, okay? He is a human being, possessed of all the frailties and fallibilities that all human beings are possessed of. If you'd taken the country to war in order to curry favour with George W. Bush, by whom you were inexplicably starstruck, and many people had died as a result, on all sides, but perhaps in terms of the blood on hands argument, it would be the members of your own armed forces and the civilians, particularly the children who died as a direct result of your decision to follow George W. Bush into an utterly ludicrous war, utterly unfounded. You know, you won't believe me when I tell you this, and I can't exactly remember where I read it, but if you trust me at all, trust me when I tell you that this was, I think I might have read it in the Washington Post, but it was first-hand source saying that George W. Bush had already decided to go to war in Iraq when somebody explained to him that there were two kinds of Muslims, Sunni and Shia. He didn't even know that. So the idea that there was ever any plan in place to deal with the aftermath of the invasion is utter pants. Still waiting for Chilcot, but just to remember for that split second that Tony Blair is a human being. If you'd done that, I don't think you could admit it was wrong. I really don't think you could. Why am I judging you by my own lax moral standards? I think I would really struggle. It's very hard to admit that you're wrong. It's very, very, very hard. Some people find it impossible, in fact. It's like sorry. Some people just can't say sorry. Some people just can't say they were wrong. I spent years trying to find some wriggle room for my support for the Iraq war. And I'm not claiming to be particularly important, whether I'd been on the radio at the time or not. I would have spent years trying to somehow retrospectively rejig the facts to fit with the wrong decision. And my defense would be this: I believed lies. I believed exaggerations, I believed embellishments, and I also had this one line, which was, at the time, I thought really powerful, and it was this. It was, people would say, well, why are we going to invade Iraq? We're not invading North Korea, we're not invading China, we're not invading Russia. There's lots of countries where human rights abuses are comparable to what Saddam Hussein has done, and we're not invading them. To which I would reply at the time by simply saying, if you've got 10 murderous, psychotic dictators up against a wall and you've only got one bullet, what are you going to do? I thought that was so brilliant. You can imagine, can't you? It's a peak smugness. I thought that was such a powerful argument. Ha, 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 ha. You've only got one bullet. Aha! What a prune I was. Honestly. And now Tony Blair is effectively condemning Jeremy Corbyn for being right about Iraq. However, just to wriggle things up even more, I think Corbyn was wrong about Syria. So you would look at what's happening there and tell me that it could have been any worse if we had backed that campaign to bomb more, if we had voted in Parliament to intervene in Syria more meaningfully. Could things really be worse than they are now? Could Islamic State somehow be an even graver threat to security? I personally don't believe it. And I personally believe that Bashar al-Assad was doing a lot of the things that we were deceitfully told Tony Blair had done. Not Tony Blair, Saddam Hussein had done. You know, when they talk about war crimes, and Corbyn has done, he's obviously got under Blair's skin on this. But I just want to remind you of that humanity argument. Because we're going to now unpick the decision, we're going to unpick the squabble, and we're going to pick a side. Gary and Cheam, mate, do you know, when I said Sunni and Shia, I thought to myself inside my head, I said, well, does anyone still do the Sunni and Shia jokes? Does anyone still do the Sunni? Gary and Cheam providing incontrovertible evidence that, yes, at least one bloke still does. Good on you, Gaz. Sonny and Sure, so it is quite funny. But there's nothing funny about this. Tony Blair attacking Jeremy Corbyn for condemning the war in Iraq but standing by while the Syrian people were barrel bombed. I kind of want you to pick a side, but I suspect the third way, just to keep everything fully Blairite, will be the most popular. In that Blair is right about Syria but was wrong about Iraq. Corbyn was wrong about Syria but right about Iraq. And the reason why we haven't done what we should have done in Syria is because of the legacy that Tony Blair left in place by getting it so wrong about Iraq. There you go, print that on a t-shirt. It's 8 minutes after 11. Let's get the phone lines open. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Tony Blair, don't forget, won 3 elections, most successful Labour leader, I think the most successful Labour leader in history, and he's very cross about being called a war criminal. Would you like to hear some of what he had to say at Bloomberg yesterday? Of course you would. Here you are.
You know, I'm accused of being a war criminal for removing Saddam Hussein, who, by the way, was a war criminal, and yet, you know, Jeremy's seen as a progressive icon as we stand by and watch the people of Syria barrel bombed, beaten and starved into submission and do nothing. You know, leave aside all of that. The issue is, for me, is what is the best way that you take the traditional values of the left and apply them to the modern world? And it's always been that.
Okay, so you tell me, Tony Blair's way or Jeremy Corbyn's way? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Crazy busy in the first hour. Crazy busy. This won't be as busy because it's not as easy to come up with an answer to the question. Not least because you can't really pick Corbyn over Blair or Blair over Corbyn when the chances are they've both been wrong and right about each of these issues. But I'll take whatever you've got on this because we haven't really had a conversation about anything linked to Labour for some time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I'm leaning more towards Corbyn on this. I think he was right about Iraq but wrong about Syria, but he might not have been wrong about Syria. Events may subsequently prove in some way that we wouldn't have improved situations by intervening sooner. I don't know. And that's the point, isn't it? That politicians aren't allowed to do. This would be Tony Blair's defence. I had to make a decision. He says, that's me. Hate that guy. You're the person in power taking difficult decisions. Jeremy is the guy with the placard. He's the guy holding it. One's the politics of power and the other's the politics of protest. I like that line. Jeremy Corbyn, the politics of protest. Tony Blair, the politics of power. I kind of need you to ring me, but I'm just wondering now whether or not this is going to be 50-50, in that they're both half right and half wrong, which is kind of the definition of a dull conversation. Let's see if we can confound that expectation. Hit the numbers now, you will get through, I promise. 0345 60 973. You can email james at lbc.co.uk and you can text me on 84850. Lots of stuff going on Twitter as well most days. It's a sort of adjunct to the show, so if you follow at Mr. James OB, you can join in there. Scott has texted from Glasgow to say if Blair thought he'd just got it wrong, he'd have admitted it long ago. He was there for financial gain, James, and he lied to the world, and that's why he can never admit it. With regards to your 1 bullet 10 dictator question, they went for the one they knew they could beat, who had the most resources to gain. I'll agree with the second half of that. I think it had a lot to do with the concept of unfinished business from George W. Bush's father's intervention in the Middle East as well. But I don't believe Tony Blair went in for financial gain, mate. I really don't. I believe he went in because he was starstruck by George W. Bush and because he was looking for a hat-trick after successful interventions in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. That's what I believe. But that's no excuse. And it's why I think if I absolutely had to pick one boat to get into, the Corbyn boat or the Blair boat, on this occasion I'd pick the Corbyn boat. Which one would you get into and why? 0345 6060 973. Tom's in Finsbury Park. Tom, what do you think?
I think Tony Blair is just completely out of order from coming now and trying to give Corbyn sort of... I heard it yesterday on the radio. Oh, why didn't people go and talk to Tony Blair and, you know, try and pick his brains, this, that and the other? No, thank you very much. I'd rather run away from Tony Blair than ask him for anything, because what we've got going on in the Middle East is because of what Tony Blair's done with IS and all the rest of it in Syria, is because of what we did in Iraq. And, you know, I just think it's absolutely despicable that I think he's got squeaky bum time because of the Chilcot report's going to be coming out.
Yes, yeah, well, he may be feeling a little bit spooked, and certainly I don't remember him using the phrase war criminal before. Well, I mean, to actually explicitly say out loud, he probably has. I just don't remember him saying, I'm accused of being a war criminal. It's almost as if he's tried to push the accusation into the long grass historically. But do you know, listening to you, I wonder if we're missing a trick, Tom, in that maybe there was an imaginable world in which we went into Iraq, we removed Saddam Hussein, and we didn't then watch as the whole region fell apart. We could have had a post-victory plan. We could have actually helped the country achieve a stability that it has failed to do so. And that's, I mean, because you're going to be skeptical about that, and that's why I find the revelation that George W. Bush didn't even know that there were Sunni and Shia sects and factions at play in the Middle East. He thought all Muslims subscribed exactly to the same religion. Truly terrifying.
Yeah, I just, it's all over, the Middle East. Afghanistan is another thing that's kicked off because of the Iraq war. All right.
No, we had to do that because the Taliban were hiding Al-Qaeda in the Hindu Kush. But so does Blair being wrong?
Weapons of mass destruction, which weren't there.
No, they never told us they were in Afghanistan, Tom. They were always only in Iraq. We went into Afghanistan to get after Osama bin Laden and his mates. Here's the question for you. Does Blair being wrong about Iraq make Corbyn right about Syria? It doesn't, though, does it? However much we might want it to.
No, not really, but I can, I just think I think what we've got in the Middle East in Syria is because of what we did back in 1991 and then a few years later, you know what I mean? And I just think it's absolutely despicable that Tony Blair now comes up and starts giving, just go away, just go into the sunlight and just walk off with Sherry and go and do what you're doing.
Retire from public life and go and spend more time with your money. It's coming up to 11:15. Tom, thank you. A couple of phone lines free if you're quick. 0345 6060973. That's the question. Tom pushed us towards it. Just because we mostly believe. Does anyone still defend the Iraq war apart from Tony Blair? And presumably Alistair Campbell, who interestingly hasn't been sent one of those letters, I'm told, offering an opportunity to respond to criticism contained within the Chilcot report, which suggests that unlike Tony Blair, Jack Straw and others, Alistair Campbell's role in the so-called sexing up of that dossier, that so-called dodgy dossier, will not be particularly criticised. Because if he was being exposed to particular criticism, he'd been offered this chance. There's a word for it. I've forgotten what the word is. That period where you can respond to criticism. It's one of the reasons why it's taken so long for the report to come out. But most people, surely everybody now, recognises that Iraq was a disaster. It was a terrible mistake. Even didn't Ed Miliband come out and say that? The last Labour leader, the current Labour leader, voted against it anyway. But the problem with what Blair's doing, perhaps, and with what Corbyn's doing, is just because Blair was wrong about Iraq doesn't mean that Corbyn is right about Syria. And Corbyn, as far as I can tell, would never be in favour of any military intervention anywhere. Except possibly an island on the side of the IRA. We can't quite make this work, can we? A choice between Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn on evidential or intellectual grounds. So let's break our golden rule on this programme and just talk about where our instincts lead us. Blair has launched a pretty stinging attack on Corbyn for condemning the war in Iraq but standing by while the Syrian people were barrel bombed. Blair, I think, because of cognitive dissonance, I think if the blood was on your hands, you'd find it impossible to admit that the whole war was wrong. I really do. I can't imagine I'd be able to, because how would you ever live with yourself if you you can convince yourself of things that aren't true? It's not very difficult to do. We're seeing it a lot at the moment, actually, in politics. It's easy. Some people sometimes believing a lie is easier than believing the truth. So Blair closes his eyes at night, sees the pictures, the faces of dead Iraqi children swimming in front of him, and he says to himself, you had no choice, Tony, you had no choice, you had to do it. George W. Bush is a visionary leader of great power, and I know what you're thinking. You think no one could swallow that nonsense, but if you had the blood of all these dead people on your hands, you'd swallow anything that made you think it wasn't your fault. So Blair can never, ever, 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 except maybe a deathbed confession to a Catholic priest. Even then, unlikely. I wonder if he has said anything in confession that he couldn't say in public. We'll never know. Such is the sanctity of confession in the Catholic Church. But I don't believe he can even contemplate the possibility that all that blood on his hands was avoidable and is his fault. But that doesn't make him wrong about Syria, and it doesn't make Corbyn right about Syria. So it's not a choice between the two, is it? It's just a talking shop this hour. Here's the story. Tony Blair launched strongest attack yet on Jeremy Corbyn for condemning the war in Iraq, but standing by while the Syrian people were barrel bombed. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to go all in. Who do you prefer, Blair or Corbyn? Amjad's in Reading. Amjad, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning, sir, and thank you very much for attending my call. I would just simply say the language of politics is not the language of explanation, and sometimes you do something in politics which is very difficult to explain, and if you keep that even everything to one side about Tony Blair, Mr. Blair, he's a very successful man. He was a top politician. If he come back to Labour Party, he will win every election. I can say that much.
No way.
And, yeah.
You think? I mean, you could say he's a very successful man. You could say Saddam Hussein was a very successful man.
He was, so then nobody could defeat him in his own country, and then he was toppled in a foreign coup. But the same with Tony Blair. If he come into politics, that is his forte. He will convince the people, and he will win the general election. That much, but then again, he wouldn't come back to politics. You see, that's what his position is at the moment.
No, well, I mean, you're describing his effectiveness as a politician. A simple question of.
He's a very successful politician, and he got that magnet. He knows how to talk, how to speak in persuasive language. Even if he come before so many tribunals, he can explain himself very well. And that happened in the whole world. Like Indira Gandhi, about 30 years before, she lost election, nobody wanted her. She publicly came, she said, she's apologized for all her wrongdoing. The same Benazir Bhutto, nobody wanted her. She came to Pakistan, she said, she's apologized for all her wrongdoing. Everybody voted her party. Politics is unfortunately like this. When you come on the scene, you present yourself very nicely, you apologize to the public for all your wrongdoing, and you promise to put country on the right direction. You give the chance to people and they vote you again.
Well, you're a very astute observer. What do you make of Jeremy Corbyn?
He's a very good man, and I think he talks a lot about the issue, which is a social issue, which people like to talk to him. But I think he should program himself to be a next prime minister, and he should really convince all the voters he's the man. He's going to be 10 Downing Street. Conservative Party is in a mess at the moment, and he should take advantages from that, and he can be a more successful leader. But a lot of people cannot see that, so he has to work hard on that, and hopefully, if time is allowed to him, he might turn out to be the most successful person.
But you're no good. You're no use. You like everybody. You think Blair's a genius and the Corbyn's a winner. What are you doing on LBC? Who don't you like?
I like your program very much.
Next. No, move along. We don't want this outbreak of warmth and generosity. It's outrageous. Flies in the face of everything we stand for, especially at weekends. 24 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Stephanie is in Redbridge. Corbyn or Blair, Stephanie?
Corbyn. But I would like to sort of wind it back a bit and say that I don't think we understand that our way of life, as it's always vaunted, is not necessarily the way of life that is suitable or indeed desirable for other countries. Now, both Saddam and Bashar al-Assad were dictators, they were unpleasant people, and they did a lot of very bad things. But having travelled very widely in the Middle East, and having been in Syria and Iraq before either of the wars started, although I wasn't instrumental in either case.
How can you prove that?
I can't.
You see? How can I believe you? How do I know you weren't there at the very front line, banging the drum for one side or the other, Stephanie? You sound a lot more connected than you're letting on.
I wish. But I do... all I would say is that having travelled around in Syria, in Damascus, I always felt safe. And I'm a white-haired, small English woman, so I do stick out. One night my husband was ill. I should say also that my husband comes from the Middle East. One night my husband was ill, and I said to him, look, I'll go to the pharmacist, which meant leaving the hotel, walking through a fairly quiet residential area down to a main street in the evening to the pharmacist. And not one single person made me feel afraid, threatened, or in any way a stranger. And I was absolutely delighted, and it was the same wherever we went. People were friendly. There were some people who questioned whether I was a Muslim or not.
Sure.
and I disabused them of that idea. But people generally were happy. They had good lives. Now, yes, there were people who were against the regime and who were being attacked, and there's no excuse for that. However, I have to say that our hands aren't entirely clean in that way either.
No, well, and you described that age-old difficulty of stability really being in the interest of the majority of the country, even if stability is enforced, whether you're looking at Saddam Hussein or even Tito or Assad, at the expense of some members of the population. Most people really, when push came to shove, if they were on the safe side, would value stability above a war designed to help those who were on the unsafe side. That's just the nature of humanity, I think.
I agree. And Iraq, before the war, Baghdad was a city that was modern, it was developing, it had, it was very sophisticated, a very good education.
But if you were married to a Kurd, you'd have a very different view. Or if you were a Kurd.
Yeah, I'm sure I would.
Yes.
I'm sure I would. So I'm speaking objectively now.
You are, yes.
Yeah. And again, it's as you said, that I think that the people who were against the regime have been exaggerated in terms of their power and influence on the rest of the population in both cases. And I really don't think that the invasion of either Syria, if it happened, and it has by the back door, or Iraq, has done an iota of good. It's cost a lot in every sense of the word. And really, I think it's entirely hypocritical to suggest that, countries like Saudi Arabia, where it is very oppressive and very frightening for a woman to walk down the street if they're European, even if you're covered in black. So, why are we so tolerant of these oppressive, non-democratic and punishing regimes? And yet...
Well, you know the answer to that, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Backsheesh and business, isn't it? I mean, Saudi Arabia, we close the M4 when the king arrives so he can take his motorcade all the way up the motorway. We roll out, it's not even a metaphorical red carpet, we'd rolled out a golden carpet for the fella if we had one, because he put so much money through British coffers. Saddam Hussein used to, so we were on his side in the Iran-Iraq war, and then he stopped, so we went against him and blew him up and killed him. Took thousands of civilians with him. And it's insane when you break it down in those terms.
Yes.
But, I know,
yes.
But would Syria really, or would the mess on that corner of the Middle East, that border between Syria and Iraq, that hinterland for Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, Daesh, do you really think that would be worse than it is now if we'd bombed Syria when we had the chance?
Yes, I do, because Daesh would have gained much more power and strength. And I think that we know who funds them. And it is that is the root of the problem. That is the problem that needs to be addressed, and not by invasion either, but by accepting the fact that we are supporting people who are, whatever the opposition in Syria feel, I'm sure that they are totally disgusted by the actions of these quasi-Muslims.
Well.
And that is causing mayhem in the world. So, we have to attack the root of the problem. And
we won't do that because it would involve attacking some of our sort of biggest allies, both commercially and militarily. Stephanie, I'm already late for the news, and I've got no idea what you're going to answer to this question. You may even plead the fifth and refuse to reply. Are you Blair or Corbyn?
I'm Corbyn.
Oh, okay.
Obviously.
Well, I didn't think it was obvious. It's probably my fault. 11:30 is the time. Stephanie, many thanks indeed. And it's probably an illustration of how unsatisfying the binary nature of modern politics is. And I fell into the trap myself of starting this hour asking you to choose between Corbyn and Blair. I still am, but more from a sense of mischief than a sense of intellectual inquiry, because I think they're both wrong and both right. Blair was wrong about Iraq, but he was probably right about Syria. Corbyn was right about Iraq, but probably wrong about Syria. What would you like to say? Seriously, anything. On the subject, you're ringing in to talk to me about Kidderminster Harriers prospects in the Vanarama Northern League next season. No, you definitely can't ring in and talk to me about Kidderminster Harriers prospects in the Vanarama Northern League next season. We'll save that until closer to the season start. Caid is in Maida Vale. Caid, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, John. I'm calling, I'm originally from Iraq.
Yes.
And I would go obviously against Tony Blair, even though they were both wrong.
Why obviously? Why obviously, Caid?
I mean, John, you see the people on TV. Maybe you see a little bit, not so many on TV. It's not so much on telly. People are destroyed. They had home destroyed. They lost their families. They lost their country. They lost their. I mean, I would say everything. If you lose home, and in my case, I lost two of my brothers, my own brothers, plus family like cousins and others. And in 2004 and last year, because of ISIS occupation of my city, I lost my family lost their home. They destroyed their home completely. Plus a lot of my cousins, they lost their homes. So I mean, whatever happens now in Iraq, you cannot compare it to Saddam's regime. Saddam was wrong. Saddam killed people, but not as bad as people thought. I would say.
Unless you were a Kurd.
Yes, this is the truth. I have, my family are in the Kurdish area now, but the Kurd, I mean, whatever they lost is not as many as people in Iraq losing, including Kurds now since Saddam left.
No, I mean, it's a brutal calculation that you do, isn't it? When you just say that there were more innocent deaths post Saddam Hussein than there were during Saddam Hussein, and I don't think anyone can argue with those statistics, grim though they are, Qaid. So Blair was wrong, Corbyn was right about Iraq. Do you have a view on Syria? Do you have a view on whether or not the West should have intervened or should be intervening more in Syria at the moment, and in fact should have overthrown Assad when they had the chance?
I think Syria. I've been to Syria 4 times, and Syria was a beautiful place, as the previous lady said. It was an amazing place to go to, and so safe. And I mean, people were happy; they didn't have any problem with. I mean, now Syria is completely destroyed. It's even worse than Iraq. And I feel so sorry for Syria, to be honest with you.
Yes, but that was
both are wrong.
That was arguably a consequence of us not intervening. When Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party and Barack Obama spoke about red lines, and David Cameron very much wanted to join Obama in an assault upon Syria, on Assad's regime, Obama wouldn't go without British support, without powerful allies, and our Parliament voted not to go. I mean, Cameron could have overruled Parliament, but do you not think the situation in Syria today would be better if the West had acted then than it is now?
I couldn't say yes or no.
Fair enough. I respect that.
This could happen anyway.
Of course, I respect that.
Could that happen anyway?
I'm very, very sorry for your loss, my friend.
No problem. Thank you very much, John, for taking me on.
That's all right. 11:37. I think when someone's talking in such poignant terms, it's probably not appropriate to correct their misunderstanding of your own Christian name. Next time, Qaid, it's James. Bashar is in Newcastle. Bashar, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi. I want to say that what Tony Blair did in Iraq was a perfect example of taking the wrong action, and what the West is doing now in Syria is a perfect example of not taking action.
Gosh. So this is, I mean, you subscribe to the notion that in many ways they were both right and both wrong, just depending on which conflict you're talking about. Corbyn was right about Iraq, wrong about Syria. Blair was wrong about Iraq, right about Syria. Can I ask what your background is, Bashar?
I'm Syrian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, one aspect that we're not talking about is the role of the Syrian regime, because that's something I know about. So during the Iraq war, I know for sure that the Syrian regime was recruiting Syrians to go fight with Al Qaeda in Iraq. So that's something no one is talking about, and what I think that the crimes that the Syrian regime has committed in Syria are definitely worth the West to intervene and should have stopped the Syrian regime when they had the chance to do so.
What would Syria look like now if we had overthrown Bashar al-Assad? I mean, there's no way we can know, but what's your theory as a citizen of the country? What do you think it would actually look like now?
I think the biggest issue is that now the communities within Syria are just basically broken up. I mean, the Sunnis and the Shia and all the Christians. It's very hard to reconcile after all 5 years of death, basically. And those who supported the regime at the beginning, they could have changed their mind, or when now they are too deep into it, they simply cannot just leave the regime. They basically stuck with the regime because they fear that the other communities are gonna kill them. And on the other side, the regime is committing horrific crimes that people are aligning with extremists. Although I know for sure that this is not what they want, but this is basically the only choice they have.
And Vladimir Putin comes out with his position in the region massively enhanced, which is bad news for everybody in the West, except, I suppose, Kremlin apologists.
I mean, the thing is, if the Russia didn't intervene, or if the West was able to kind of negotiate some solution with Russia without having the Vladimir Putin outsmarting everybody else, things wouldn't have been that bad in Syria.
Bashar, thank you. I do obviously have a motto on the program: if you build it, they will come. And there's a comedy segment that we normally interject at this point, but I think it would be a little inappropriate today. It is, however, testament to the power of this particular switchboard on this particular radio station that you start talking about matters Syrian. And the last two callers we've taken, you have people who were at the sharp end of the Iraq war, and a gentleman who has sort of fled Syria as a result of the war there. It's 11:41. Ope is in Haringey. Ope, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning. I would like to say a couple of things. So if I was to decide between Tony Blair and Corbyn, I would rather choose a third alternative. But for the binary answer, I'll go for Tony Blair.
Good. When you put it so intelligently, it makes me realise the inadequacy of my original question, Ofe. Thank you for indulging me.
No, but I'll do that. But when I think about the Iraq and Syria,
Yes.
I'd say what happened in Iraq was wrong. What's happening in Syria is wrong. Different perpetrators.
Yes.
But looking at it from the actual victim's perspective, they're very wrong. With Tony Blair, for different reasons, maybe reasons that are not expressed to the public as truthfully or accurate as it could be, it was wrong to do what he did. But he might have maybe learned a lot of things and trying to make things better with Syria by suggesting an intervention. With Corbyn, I think he's indecisive when it comes to global politics. He's more of a protester. Although I admire what he's doing, as a leader, if I had to choose the two of them, I'll choose someone who's more decisive, who I can actually.
Well, this is the absolute. You're brilliant, actually, because for me, this is the absolute difference between Corbyn and Blair, and I think I now understand better what Blair meant. Listening to you, I have a better understanding of what he meant when he talked about the person in power taking difficult decisions. He's never going to say he took the wrong decision, but he tacitly acknowledges that being the person who has to take decisions means that sometimes they will be wrong. Corbyn is dedicated to perpetual protest and never does anything, is his argument, is Blair's argument.
No, but if you look at history, if you read the books like Prince by Machiavelli, these are difficult decisions that need to be taken, regardless of whether they have the public opinion by their side. And I'm not saying I sympathize and empathize with the people who are victims of this, but as a global leader, you have to not just take care of your constituents, but also where you are on the world stage.
Yes, and that's pragmatism. I mean, it's pragmatism versus idealism or principle, if you want to find an alliteration. It's pragmatism versus principle, and you can't take your principles to their logical conclusion. Sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do because you think that they're the least bad option.
I mean, exactly. I mean, to put it more sort of conceptually, the question would then be, to what extent do you want to bridge the gap between idealism and realism?
Yes.
Is it possible? Or is that being idealistic in itself?
No,
so
flip it out, mate. Mystery Hour doesn't start until 12 noon.
Okay, but to answer your question and the other callers on the line, I would say I'd rather go for Tony Blair because obviously he would have lessons learned. He's more of a leader in terms of getting people together.
Yes, getting things done. Getting things done involves making tough decisions that may sometimes prove to be wrong. Jeremy Corbyn, perhaps this is an unfair representation of him, but it's one which I recognise and you make, is increasingly appears to have the sort of demeanour of a person who will never make a tough decision. He'll always be umming and ahhing and wringing his hands and worrying about this and worrying about that. So just because he turned out retrospectively to be right about Iraq does not mean he was right about Syria. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Speaking of Tony Blair, he's now giving a speech on I think the same podium as Sir John Major about the EU referendum in Northern Ireland. We dedicated the first hour of the programme to the EU referendum, most notably to the frankly bizarre development overnight that saw people objecting to the notion of other people getting a vote who hadn't registered by the final deadline, a final deadline that was rendered obsolete, of course, by the collapse of the government website. It was a fascinating hour, though. There's some good clips emerging from that. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll be able to see them. Back to Blair versus Corbyn, a somewhat fatuous distinction on my part, but it's proved to be an effective way into the conversation. I can prove that to you by pointing out that you won't get through if you try and ring in now, but as soon as I finished with Alan in Uxbridge, you might. Judicious use of redial is the answer to your problems if you're emailing me to complain about not being able to get through. Alan is in Uxbridge. Alan, what would you like to say?
Hello, hi. I'd like to talk about the Blair. Obviously, I support the Blair, what he did in Iraq, because I was living in Iraq at that time. But is it not true that Saddam was only bad for Kurds? It was good for Kurds and Shia as more than half of the Sunni. He killed 188,000 of Kurds and destroyed 5,000 villages. Same for Shia. And against Sunni, he was very bad, except for those from the same city as him and a very close person to him. But
I understand your point, and it's absolutely inarguable. Of course, it wasn't just the Kurds that suffered from Saddam Hussein's excesses. I apologise if that was the impression you've got from the programme thus far. I can understand why it is. But can I ask you a question? And because obviously shortage of time is relevant here, so forgive me if this is clumsy in any way. Surely the reason that you're now living here in Uxbridge suggests that the situation in Iraq is worse as a result of when you lived there and Tony Blair led an invasion.
You can say that for the Baghdad and some other cities, but for Kurdistan now it's much better than before, because Saddam was only working for Baghdad and for some his city, Tikrit. Nothing in the south for the Shia cities and Kurdistan. Do you believe I was in a city more than 1 million? We didn't have a big hospital. We didn't have a university. He did nothing for Kurdistan apart from making some military road to fight Iran, because we are in the border with Iran. It was about the Baghdad. The top university in the Middle East was in Baghdad. Everything, scholarship, education was for Baghdad. Nothing for Kurds and for Shia and for the other Sunni parts which were not supporting him. So Which leads me to ask a question. I've already apologised for the clumsiness of it, but why are you living in Uxbridge then if the situation in Iraq was improved by the invasion? In your part, as a Kurd, in your part of Iraq? Yeah, I came for a study. I'm a study now. I may go back in the close future when I finish my study and the work experience.
Okay, that's me told. Have you been into balcony shirts yet, Alan, while you've been in Uxbridge?
Not yet.
Go, it's on the main street. Pop into balcony shirts. Ask for Scott and tell him you get the James O'Brien listener discount. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Any T-shirt you want. 11:52 is the time, and that is why I love my job. Alan can give us some first-hand insights, genuinely first-hand insights, and I can make a pure old schoolboy reference to one of the long-time listeners to this programme. Phil is in Westminster. Phil, what's going on?
Oh, hi, James. I think we're all coming from the perspective that the Americans and Tony Blair thought the whole thing in Iraq now is a complete disaster. I think they got exactly what they wanted. The idea was just to topple Saddam Hussein, because him, Gaddafi and the others were going to start selling oil in gold in their own currency rather than US dollars. So, therefore, everything's hunky-dory. They didn't really need an exit plan, because all they wanted to do was be a lesson to everybody else in the region. It was going to be sold in US dollars, because it would have cost them absolutely billions if it wasn't. And I've got another point to make.
Go on.
Well, I think Tony Blair knows he's done wrong.
Yeah, I do as well, but he can't admit it. You wouldn't be able to admit it if you had that much blood on your hands.
Well, now I'm going to say something very contentious, and you're probably going to get very angry.
As a general rule, when people warn me that they're about to say something very contentious and I'm about to get very angry, I generally just get bored. But just take that as a friendly warning.
Okay. He converted to Catholicism.
Yes.
Right. As you know, one of the few religions where you can do the most horrendous things and then be, in inverted commas, forgiven for them. So I think he's really played, that card in an effort to sort of, justify or ease his conscience.
Is there no confession in the Anglican Church?
I don't know. I've never been.
Well, that's the only thing. I mean, angry is a million miles away from what I feel in response to what you said. It was interesting. I'm neither bored nor angry, but I think you need to be clear on whether or not you can take a sacrament of confession in the Anglican Church before you can say that's why he converted to Catholicism, because his belief in God is so profound that he changed religion as a sort of reverse ferret on his personal culpability for the deaths caused in Iraq, which, according to your own analysis, he wanted anyway.
I think he would have preferred not having the deaths in Iraq, but I think it was what the Americans call collateral damage for achieving their aim.
Okay, I mean, you've got a lot of theories. I doubt they're all wrong, but I think probably on the notion of him converting so that he would get a free path from God on the deaths he feels personally responsible for, but kind of was prepared to accept on the grounds of intervening commercially on Saddam Hussein's plans to trade gold and oil under his own currency instead of under the international standard, might just be pushing it a little bit far. But you were wrong to say I was going to get angry. I was wrong to say I was more likely to get bored. There you go. We live and learn. Peter's in Orpington. Peter, what have you got?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, Peter.
I would say tell the relatives of the people who died at Halabja from the chemical weapons, I think there were, that Saddam Hussein used against him, that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. I think you have to stop a dictator, thug, tyrant getting hold of the weapons before.
Well, then you need to find me someone who thinks that life is better now.
Well, it's easy to be wise after the event, isn't it?
That's what you just did.
And no, I think
Halabja. This is now after the event of Halabja. It's very easy to be wise after the event. So you find me someone who thinks Iraq is better now, with the exception of the corners where Saddam Hussein was particularly gross, in Kurdistan and elsewhere. Who thinks Iraq's better now than it was before we went in?
Well, as I say, it's easy to be wise after the event, and I'm not saying it is better. My complaint with Tony Blair and George Bush, and in fact his father, is that they didn't think it through properly in the first place and allowed things to get out of hand. In fact, I think from the leaks from the government report, that pretty well sums up what they think.
That's not. I don't think we're going to win any prizes for that observation. That the absence of an exit strategy is something on which almost everybody seems to be able to agree now, except the last caller, of course, who thinks that it was deliberate to leave. They didn't really care about the chaos that got left behind because mission accomplished was the oil and gold question. So you're saying Blair did the right thing then?
Yes, I do.
Even now, you still believe that?
Even if.
And if I point out all the reasons why you're wrong, you'll just say hindsight is a wonderful thing.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I was an Amnesty International coordinator in the early 1980s. Now, I know that most people in Amnesty International would not agree with my views. So these are my views. But I was working for an Iraqi prisoner at that time, and reading Amnesty stuff, I mean, it scars the mind.
Of course it does, but we were on his side in the early 80s in the Iran-Iraq war.
Oh, yes, I'm quite well aware of that. And the West and the arms traders have an awful lot of to answer for. But there's the Supergun affair, there's the Matrix Churchill affair. And I think the British government was as culpable as Saddam Hussein. But you don't allow a thug like that to get hold of nuclear weapons. And Kim Jong-un of North Korea has got them. And everybody's terrified.
Okay. I'm not.
Well, I am.
Are you really? In Orpington? You're terrified about Kim Jong-un having a nuclear weapon?
No, not on a personal basis, but...
I thought that's what you meant. I'm not terrified. I can't tell you what, it's a bit rich, isn't it, Peter, me having a pop at you for hyperbole when it's really my stock in trade every morning between 10 and 1. I'm terrified, I'm outraged, I'm dismantling you, I'm destroying you. Of course it is terrifying that a madman has a nuclear bomb. Of course it is. I apologise for picking you up on your choice of word, Peter.
No problems.
Have a great day. It's coming up to 11:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and actually this hour, a lot more interestingly, not listening to me, as this text puts it best, from Paul. Great radio, James, hearing first-hand accounts from Syrians and Iraqis, far more thought-provoking than our speculating from a distance. Although I think the speculating we did from a distance that hour was a little more interesting than average as well.